Welcome to CodeRage. This is a session about Delphi language enhancements, or more specific, Delphi class and record helpers. My name is Bob Swart. I'm also often called Dr. Bob. I won the Spirit of Delphi Award in 1999 together with Marco Cantu. I'm currently an Embarcadero MVP. I'm a technical author. I've written hundreds of articles for the Delphi magazine, among others. I'm a trainer. I write my own courseware manuals that are available for sale as PDF for people who cannot attend my training. I'm a consultant, a remote developer for hire if you want to, and a reseller in the Eurozone. If you go to bobswart.com, you can go to my regular website at www.drbob42.com. In this session I will talk about Delphi class helpers that were introduced in Delphi 8.4.net and extend classes with some kind of horizontal functionality, methods and functions and procedures to extend a class that all derived classes can benefit from. I will also talk about Delphi record helpers, which have been introduced new in Delphi XE3. And these also extend native types like integers and strings and records with functionality, as opposed to class helpers that only work on classes. A definition from the Delphi help itself. A class or record helper is a type that, when associated with another class or record, introduces additional method names and properties that may be used in the context of the associated type, or its descendants. Helpers are a way to extend a class without using inheritance, which can be useful, for example, when adding method names and properties to types like records or integers, for example. So these are really useful language constructs. There are a number of helper classes inside Delphi. Some of them are internal, like the TTextControl2String class helper for TObject found in the fmx.types unit. This one is defined in the implementation section only, and it adds the function toString to TObjects in FireMonkey. So we can have a toString method of all objects derived from TObject. Another example is in the fmx.types 3D unit, where we, for example, have a tBitmap helper, a class helper for tBitmap. This is a public class helper that we can all access also in our own code, and it means that the context reset handler, the getTexture and the stackTexture methods property are added to the specific tBitmap type. So this is horizontally injected in that specific type. Also in the SOAP HTTP header transport, there's a class helper for the THTTP request response object, where we have an additional function handle when inet error and a procedure raise check. These are only added if not defined use indie. So when not using indie, then these two methods are added, otherwise they're not used. And finally, in an SOAP opt to SOAP DOM converter, there's an if-def-fix ln node. In that case, there's also a class helper defined for the SOAP DOM conf helper. A class helper to access the element num namespace property if you need to do that. When Delphi 2009 introduced Unicode, some of my existing code would now show some warnings. For example, trying to compare characters in sets. A character is no longer a single byte, so comparing characters to sets of characters will now raise a warning. For example, if C in A to Z, if C is in a lowercase letter, then do something. If I compile this code, we will get a warning that a white char has been reduced to byte char in set expression. Consider using char in set function in sysutils unit. So we should actually use another function to get away with this warning. So we can replace this code by a char in set of C and then my set. Okay, so if this expression, then, and this no longer leads to a warning. Okay, C might not have been initialized, but the warning is gone. Now the char in set method comes from sysutils and is actually using another class from the character class. So if we add the system.character unit to the users clause and inspect the TCharacter class, We here see a class shield that has all kinds of checks for is control, is digit, is letter. We can also use the same thing. You can also say T character is letter of C, for example. And this is also an expression that will return if a character C is a letter or a digit. Now this T character class is a sealed class, meaning we cannot extend it anymore with other methods. But apart from letters and digits, there's not a specific method to check if a letter, a character, is a vowel, if it's the A, E, I, O or U. If I want to implement the is vowel, I cannot extend and derive from T character class. But I can use a trick. I can write a helper class that will actually extend the T character class to add this new method. So let's go to my unit CodeRage helpers and let's define my helper class here. So first we need to add the system.character unit to the users clause, and now I can define my TMyChar helper is class helper for T character. And this class helper only contains a single method. It's the class function is vowel, taking a character as input and returning a boolean if it is indeed a vowel. Now the implementation of this is pretty easy. We can say result colon equals C in A, E, I, I, O or U, O or U. This would of course lead to the warning that we saw earlier. That's why I showed you the example. And apart from doing this, we can also do the in set of C and then this particular set. And of course we need to add system.sysutils to the users clause to get our hands on the in set. So compiling this code leads to the single warning that C might not have been initialized, but at least the warning here is gone and we can have a result in set in all the vowel characters. And this TMyChar helper will actually extend the T character class now by horizontally inserting this method. So going to CodeRage 7, T character dot, I can now have the is vowel. It's not in the list here because the unit defining the class helper is not in my users clause. In order for class helper to become visible, for the extended methods to become visible, the unit must be added to the users clause. So I must now add my CodeRage helpers class to the users clause, and if I start code inside again, we now see the is a vowel. So now I can actually check if it's a vowel then. And of course let's initialize C with a character. So if character is vowel then, and all warnings are gone, and now my T character class, the sealed class, has been extended with a new method using my class helper to define this new method for the T character class. And I can add the is vowel behavior to the class. You can do this with any existing class. You can extend it with horizontally methods. Apart from deriving from the class, which is not possible because it's a sealed class, we can still add new functionality and new methods by defining class helpers, which can be a really nice and powerful feature, if you ask me. Record helpers are similar as class helpers, but they work for non-class types, like strings, integers, singles, records, arrays, and even enumerated types, as we'll see in the examples. There are 10 record helpers or helper types defined in Delphi XE3. This is a list of 9 of them: single helper, double helper, extended helper to extend these types, GUID helper, string helper, the TD2D matrix 3x3 F helper, an element margins helper, a critical section helper, and a condition variable helper. These are helper classes to extend specific types. For example, if we take a look at the single helper, the single helper is actually replacing the deprecated T-single record, which is a packed record with a number of functions and procedures, and this structure is deprecated. We should now use the TSingleHelper record helper instead, which extends the single type and actually adds functions and procedures and constants to this specific single type. To illustrate this, if you go back to our application and I add a little local variable, let's call it x of type single, we can now write code like x dot, and then code inside will show up and shows the values, epsilon, a max value, a min value, positive infinity, negative infinity, not a number. These are all variables. We also have functions. We can get to the exponent, the fraction or the mantissa of this specific single type. That's quite useful because it's no longer just a type, it's actually like an object type. Same thing with string. If we have a string, we can have several functions on string. Empty, we can compare strings to other strings, copy stuff from strings, insert, delete. So we no longer have to remember all the string functions, but we can just have a local variable of type string and do as x dot, and then for example copy from one string to another. And that's very useful, and we can also define our own class helpers if we want. There's also an internal record helper, that's a TUint32Helper found in the system.classes unit. This one is implemented in the implementation section of this unit, so we don't have access to it ourselves. But this record helper for an unsigned integer 32 has the getBytes, getWords, setByte and setWords methods to convert this cardinals to uint8, uint16, or to extract values and bytes from it. And that's used internally in the RTL, so record helpers are actually used by Delphi itself. We can also define our own class helpers, or record helpers in this case. For example, an integer helper, converting an integer to a string. So I can define my TIntegerHelper class here. It's a record helper for integer, so instead of defining a class that we have add a helper to, it's now an actual plain type, an integer. And we can add the function toString returning a string. You can even make it inline to make sure it's a bit optimized. There's no calling overhead. The implementation of toString, that's of course just the simple int toString of self. Self in this case represents the value of the type that we write the helper about. So record helper for integer, and then self is the actual integer. So int toString will convert the integer to a string, returning that particular value as a result of our toString call. Okay, we cannot have actual instances of these. So let's create a local variable of type integer, and now using the x we actually have the function toString. So I can now do the x toString, we can add a write line x toString, and of course we must assign a value to x. So this code will assign 42 to x, and then we do a write line of x toString. Well, using a toString in a write line is of course not necessary, but you can get the idea that you can convert anything to a string and write it to a file or log file or something else and do something with it. We can also define our own custom helper for tDate. In this case to convert a date to a string as well. So that's a tDateHelper. It's a record helper for tDate with the function toString returning a string, and let's make this one inline as well. Now the first and simple implementation is result colon equals date to string of self. That's the easiest one, just converting the date to a string. And if you go to our project, CodeRage 7, and we can for example do a date, which is the current date, and the date definition. Let's add today as my tDate. Today is the current date, and then we have today.toString, and then we can actually have the string representation of today. So let's put that in a write line statement, and with the read line to make sure we can see what the console is doing. I run this application, and now on my machine we see 42. I see the current date. That's year, month, date. The year, month and date where I recorded this presentation. However, you may not like the representation of year, month, date. You may want to change it to month, day, year, or day, month, year. In that case, we need to tweak our date helper. You can actually pass the format to our toString method. Instead of calling date toString with a format setting, we can actually pass the format string itself to the function toString. In this case, the function toString will be extended with a const short date format string, which is a default argument. So by default it's empty, so we can still call the old toString function. Oops, that's the argument. So now, if you go to the implementation, we can check if the short date format is specified, and in that case we must have our own local format settings, assign the short date format to the short date format of the local format settings, and pass that to date toString. So let's create my local format settings, T format settings. Local format settings has the short date format, which is our short date format, but we should only do this in case short date format is not an empty string. If it's not an empty string, then we must copy the short date format to our local format setting and call the date toString of self, passing the local format settings. And that will make sure that our short date format that we pass as argument to the toString is used by the format settings to convert the date to a string. And otherwise, without the short date format passed as the argument, we call the original date to self, date to string of ourselves. Going back to our application, so this write line today of toString, this toString function actually has an optional argument, as you can see by code inside. So we can optionally pass day, month, year to this method. And now if I run the application, we get the day, month and year, and I forgot the slashes or the dashes. So let's, oh actually I did add the slashes or the dashes. It's probably the format settings is empty here, so let's do the local format settings dot date separator, and let's change it to a dash or a slash. This local format settings here will probably be empty when we define it here. So next time when we run the application, we will neatly get the day, month, year now with the dashes. And I leave it as an exercise to the reader to extend the toString here even further, and apart from passing short date format, also passing the date separator here. So you can actually define dynamically both the short date format and the date separator in your code to the toString function of a date, like today. Custom record helpers can also be defined on array types. For example, we can define a TArrayHelper or a TIntegerHelper as a record helper for TIntegerDinArray. And IntegerDinArray is defined in system.types, and TIntegerDinArray is just an alias for array of integer. So we can define a record helper for a array of integer, and for example we can add the function max returning an integer. And we can have a function ToString, returning the string representation of the entire array of integer. So let's implement these two methods, and then I can show you how we can use them with an array of integer to get to the maximum number or get the string representation of it. So for max, let's start by, we need a counter I of type integer, and we start by assuming that there's no maximum and where we have to return something, so let's return min max int. We could also raise an exception here if you want to. For I is low self to high self, do, and that's the array, if self of I, so if the current item, if it's bigger than a result, then result colon equals self I. So if the current element is bigger than the result that we have so far, then the result is this current element. And this will just walk through all the items in our array and return the maximum number. So that should be fairly easy. Converting the array to a string also includes a counter I of type integer, and here we start with an empty string, and then for I equals low of self to high of self, we just add two results, self I dot toString. So we no longer have to call the string to int because self is an integer, and in this unit we implemented the TIntegerHelper over to string, so self I to string, and maybe add a little space to it. Now, in the end, we may actually put the whole thing in square brackets if we want to returning it. So these are two methods that extend an array of integer. So never mind this squirrely braces. Let's return to our application. And we already got a warning that variable y is declared but never used in CodeRage 7. That's correct, I just declared the array of integer. And we can use it here. So we can do a set length of y, let's define it as 10. And let's now fill it, so for x colon equals low of y to high, do, let's use a random number, so we fill it with 10 random numbers, and then I want to present the maximum number, so that's y dot max, and that maximum number I want to get the string representation and then send it to the output using write line. So max equals, okay. Optionally, by the way, we could extend the toString method to have a prefix, like here max is, and toString could have a prefix and then the actual value of that integer variable. But this is okay as well. So let's compile the code, let's run it, and here we have the maximum happens to be 99. Well, in order to prove it, let's print the entire list. So instead of just saying print the maximum, I want to print the entire list to make sure that it's actually 99. Oops, oh, why? Well, of course we cannot print the entire array, but we can print the array toString. And this time if we run it, we get the array, and the array is 20, 33, this is 96, so that's actually the maximum number. By the way, you see that you may want to remove the last character from this list if you want to create a nice output, but I leave it as exercise to the reader again. At least we see that the maximum number that it found is the correct maximum number in this random array of integers. And we see that we could convert the complete array of integer to a string, and we could call the maximum number of this array and write it to the output. One more thing I have to say, that the record helpers don't just work on Variables, they also work on types like this, 100, and we can call the toString method of 100. Or we can actually have an expression like x plus 1 and then call toString for the expression x plus 1, which again is an integer, and then toString of x plus 1 would be, if it's still 42, it would be 43. So modifying this, instead of right-lining 42 now, we actually add 1, and this expression can also be used to call that record helper. So they're actually quite flexible, the record helpers, both in defining and calling them in our custom code. The final example of a record helper is one that I want to implement for enumerated types. So let's, for example, define tMyEnum as, for example, me none, me a few, me some, and me a lot. So this is an enumerated type, and I can also define the TIntegerHelper as a record helper for tMyEnum, with, of course, the infamous function toString, returning a string as inline. So, and here we can have actually a case statement, case self of, and now Delphi's own feature will show me all possible values that self can have, none, a few, some, and a lot. And all we need to do is write a single line of code to return the result. So this is none, and let's do some copy and paste here. This is a few, this can be some, and this is a lot. And of course these are values with strings with spaces in them. You can also return the actual me none, me a few, me some if you want to, but I think this is more readable. And this shows how we can return an enumerated type and each label to a string representation. And then as soon as we use the tMyEnum in my application, so let's add another one of z of type tMyEnum, and let's say z colon equals me a few, and if you don't want to use code aside this way, we can also say tMyEnum dot and use the scoped and numerals feature. So now we can select the value, so for example some, and then a dot, and then the toString representation. Well, of course that can not be assigned to z, but z sum, and then z can be a toString, and we can do the right line of z toString. But as we saw, we can also have the right line of the expression tMyEnum dot a lot dot toString, and this is just an expression of the a lot value of the tMyEnumerated type, representing converted to a string, and we can write that to the output. So it's not just limited to actual variables, we can also use these record helpers on actual values or expressions, as I showed you earlier. So let's run this particular instance of the application, and the output here sum for my sum, and this is a lot, converted to the string a lot. And let's again check the string. These are 10 numbers and 88 is the biggest one, so this still works. So this was actually the last example of the record helper that I want to show you. So I've shown you character class helper, a record helper for integer, for tDate. For an integer din array, you can extend it to any array, of course. And for enumerated types. And here are the implementations of these, and feel free to use them or extend them. There's some ways you can still extend them even further, of course. Final remark on record helpers. Only one helper can be active or visible at a given time based on the scope. So if you have multiple integer helpers or string helpers, for example, then the one in the unit most in the final scope, from the units in the use clause from right to left, the one defined in your scope will be the one active. So you cannot have more than one integer helper or string helper, etc. active at a given time. So that's something to keep in mind when adding these record helpers or class helpers for yourself. When building new frameworks, new hierarchies, you should really use the normal object-oriented inheritance, polymorphism and encapsulation rules instead of using class helpers and record helpers, which are a good thing to add horizontal functionality, but are not a good way to define new structures and new frameworks. For more information, for example, if you see this presentation as a replay from CodeRage instead of seeing it live, you can contact me by email at bob@ebob42.com or visit my website as www.drbob42.com. You can also try to link with me through LinkedIn with my Dr. Bob 42 account, or visit my page of Bob Swart Trading and Consultancy on Facebook at www.facebook.com/drbob42. I'm also available to contact on Skype as ebob42 or Twitter as ebob42 again. Anyway, thanks for your time. Let me know how you feel about this presentation or other nice Delphi features, and I hope to talk to you soon. Bye.
Bob, you've been doing a great job triaging the questions. Let's go through some of them. And I'm recording the questions, and we've got them in the log so that we can have them after the fact. One of the questions was, given your example, if I inherit from T character, will my derived class have isVowel?
Well, yes. If you add a class helper for any class, then the new methods that you add will be visible not just for that class, but also for all derived classes from that particular class. However, in this case, TCharacter class, it's a sealed class, which for this particular example means you cannot extend from it any further. Otherwise, I could just have extended it and derived my own class, adding the isVowel method. But since it's a sealed class, you cannot extend it. But for a normal class, like a TCustomEdit, you can add a class helper for TCustomEdit, and then the new method will appear in TCustomEdit, but also in TEdit, derived from TCustomEdit, TMemo, and all other classes derived from the class where you add your class helper to.
And then I think you answered this one not only online, but later on in your presentation from when it was asked, and it was about, can you have multiple helpers visit at the same time for the same type? And the answer I think you said was no, right?
Yeah, unfortunately, you cannot have more than one class helper or record helper visible at the same time. There can only be one visible or active, and that's the one last defined in your scope, which means if you have class helpers in different units, then the last unit in your users clause will, for your current scope, define the class helper that's visible. If you define two class helpers in the same unit, then again the last one will override the previous one, so you can only have one class helper or record helper. And again, unfortunately, you cannot derive from one class helper to create a new one. So if you want to copy existing functionality, you should indeed perhaps consider to copy actual code from one class helper into your own extended class helper and then add your own methods.
Then there was a question, can a class helper, record helper, can it be associated with multiple classes?
Well, not per se. Like I said earlier, the first question, a class helper, if you define a class helper for a particular class, then all derived classes will also have that particular method. But you cannot say this is a class helper for TEdit and TListBox, for example. You could look at a common ancestor, or you could go to the TObject level, although there is already a class helper for TObject level. But it's not currently possible to define in one definition a class helper for two different classes. You just have to again copy the class helper definition once for one class and once for the other class.
And then Jonas was, let's see, he was talking about EnumHelper is what he was missing. I think Jonas was mentioning that. Okay. Let's see. Rodolfo was saying now we can forget about using things like int to string and float to int and so on, I guess.
Yes.
That's true?
Yep.
Okay. Let's see. Oh, there's always been a discussion about what we should actually call these things. You know.
Yeah.
Type
Well,
helper, class helper, record helper, and I always say, like, what's in a name? You know.
Yeah. As long as they work, it doesn't really matter how they're called.
Yep. Boyan was asking, do these helpers also work with interfaces? I haven't tried interfaces.
I don't know. I can't answer that, sorry. I will try, but it will take a while before I have the answer. Sorry.
Okay. Yep. Any performance disadvantages when using the helpers?
Not that I know, but you may have noticed that I made them inline just to try to tell the compiler to avoid the call and return, so they just expand inline. In that case, it's really no difference than actually calling the int to string, for example, because then it's just the same as calling that particular method. It's just easier to type because code inside will help you to create the entire expression.
Can you derive from a helper to create another helper?
No, you cannot currently.
Okay. Let's see. What about the visibility of helped class variables within the helper in addition to self? The visibility.
I don't know what this question.
Yeah, it's Oliver's question. Let's see.
Yeah. How about visibility of help class variables within the helper in addition? Yeah, sorry, Oliver, please.
Okay. Yep. Oh, somebody's asking about books, Bob. XE3 books.
Yes. This week I released my the first edition of my Delphi XE3 Developer Essentials, which actually covers the class helpers and record helpers. I sent it to my existing customers. Since it's only the first edition, it will be about a week before I make it available for other people to purchase. And I've also almost finished my SOAP manual, and I will follow shortly with the DataSnap one.
Excellent. Oh, Olivier was, I guess he said, is only self-visible or also class fields and privates, or as helpers?
I guess all fields should be visible, but self is representing the type. So if you have a record, for example, and you extend the record, then all the fields of that record are available, if that's what he means.
Okay.
But I'm still not sure what he wants to ask, sorry.
Yeah. I think you might want to look through too. There were some that were more general informational questions about CodeRage and so on. Yes, we'll get the replays up as soon as possible. Last time, I think I put them up by the end of each day, so I'll try to do that today. Although Anders is in Germany, so it's me and Christine here. So we'll see whether I find some time to do it. I think we covered quite a bit. There's sort of a general question about why are classes sealed, and to me, sealed is based on the decision of the class designer. Just as do you publish things, make them public, make them private, and so on.
Indeed.
Yeah, and I know sealed was added along the way to help, people building reusable classes to make those decisions to not allow anyone to inherit certain parts.
And it was sometimes necessary for .NET assemblies.
Yep. Yeah, it's just that reminder, I guess, of class helpers were around since, what, Delphi 8, I think?
Yes, Delphi 8 introduced them.
Yep. Okay. I think, let's see, let me look down again. Let's see. Oh, here's more, Olivia. I was referring to class helpers. Class helpers. Okay. Can you access protected and private? The access rule should be the same, right? Regardless of whether it's a class helper or whatever.
Correct. So you can only access private fields if you're defined in the same unit, which is typically not the case.
Yep.
So it's not a way to make private fields visible to the outside world by just adding a class helper that exposes that private field. That's unfortunately not possible.
Let's see, are there any common helpers available to download, for example, string, int, float? I think someone put up a link earlier to your examples. I think it was just up here, Cyprian posted. You've got a zip file with your examples on bobswart.nl, weblog/ftp/coderage7.zip. It's in the Q&A log. I'll post that. Let's see, can I post that link? I'll post that in the, where did it go? I can't click on something now. That's weird. Okay, let me. I'm going to put that in that link over here in the chat window for everybody. That way, you've got it in the chat window. Everyone, you can just click on the link to get to the zip file.
Okay.
Some general questions. Is there any way to call the helper functions interpretively? Interpretively. I.e., if I was given a string here, y.max, is there a way to evaluate it?
No, not any easier than just calling any other Delphi method interpretively.
Yeah.
So
if you're debugging, you could always go to the expression evaluator, I guess, and see what happens.
Yes, if the debugger can see the compiled version of your class helper or record helper.
Yep. Yeah. Okay. What is this? Okay, so there's some other general questions here. Anything else for Bob? We're coming up on our break, but Bob is live online, so if you have any more questions for Bob, put them in the Q&A window. Again, some of these other questions I'll take care of that are,
Sure.
And we'll have this whole log available. Let's see. Are helper methods added automatically by the compiler to the API? I'm just saying, I guess not, question mark?
Well, I think they are, because for the developer and for code inside, the methods just show up.
As long as it's compiled, right? As long as it's compiled.
Yeah, as long as you have the unit with the class helper or record helper compiled with your units and you're using them, then the RTTI should be there because the compiler knows about it, code inside knows about it. So it should be available.
So Buena's question, I missed that earlier. He asked, can helpers be used for operator overloading? Have you tried helpers with operators?
No, I haven't.
Okay, but operators ultimately are just method implementations, right?
Yeah, operators are for specific, the specific operators. Maybe the assignments, the conversion, the implicit to string conversion, that could perhaps replace it to string. I'm not sure. I would have to play with it.
Yep.
That's some good questions from Borian.
In a nutshell, Walter's asking, why helpers besides desperate hacks? I love the term desperate hacks.
Well, they make me more productive. If I have to write an int to string and a date to string and put brackets and then put the result in another variable, etc. Now I can just have an expression with the date, doing the to string with the format, and then do something else. It's the code inside that helps me to actually write faster code. Oh, I see someone comments that you can't do operator overload with record helpers.
Yeah, Colin was saying that. Okay.
So maybe he already tried it.
Did people developing third-party libraries use helpers? They use helpers that someone using their library could accidentally overwrite their helper accidentally?
I'm not sure if that scenario is true, because the implementation of a third-party component, if that implementation uses a helper, then it's the users clause of that particular implementation unit that uses the helper. A new helper will never be inserted in the scope of that third-party unit. So I don't think that what Matthew is considering will actually happen. Only if you can edit that third-party source code, perhaps. But then you just have to take care of what you're doing. So I don't think it's a problem if third-party libraries use helpers. No. And yes, Scott, I'm working on a Mobile Studio book.
Okay. There's the answer, Scott. And Bob, you've always been great. I mean, you're always updating and creating new books for people as well as your training materials, so that's cool.